The rain drummed against the funeral home windows like impatient fingers, each drop a reminder that even the heavens wept for Dennis. I stood at the back of the room, my black dress clinging to my 62-year-old frame, watching strangers offer condolences to my son Ralph as if he were the grieving widow, as if I didn't exist. 43 years of marriage, and I had become invisible in my own tragedy. Mom. Ralph's voice cut through my thoughts like a blade wrapped in silk. At 38, he had inherited his father's sharp jawline but none of his warmth. His wife Beverly stood beside him, her perfectly manicured fingers resting on his arm like a claim of ownership. "We need to talk." The funeral director had dimmed the lights, and the last mourners were filtering out into the October evening. My husband's casket sat closed at the front of the room, surrounded by flowers that would wilt before his memory in most of these people's minds. I smoothed my dress, the same black one I'd worn to my mother's funeral 15 years ago, and followed my son to a corner where shadows gathered like conspirators. "About the arrangements," Ralph began, his voice carrying that businessman's efficiency that had made him successful in real estate. "Beverly and I have been discussing the logistics. Logistics. As if grief could be organized into neat columns on a spreadsheet. The house is too big for you now," Beverly interjected, her voice honey-sweet with false concern. She was 35, blonde, and had never liked me from the moment Ralph brought her home 8 years ago. "You'll be so much happier in assisted living. We've already looked at some lovely places." My heart started beating faster, but I kept my face neutral. Dennis had always said I had a poker face that could fool the devil himself. "I haven't decided what I want to do yet." "Well, that's the thing," Ralph said, glancing at his wife before continuing. "Dad left the house to me. The lawyer read the will this morning." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I remained standing. Dennis and I had discussed the will years ago, when Ralph was still in college. We'd agreed that everything would go to me first, then to him after I was gone. "That can't be right." "I have the papers in the car," Ralph said, pulling keys from his pocket. "My house keys," I realized with growing horror. "Dad must have changed his mind. You know how worried he was about you managing everything alone." Dennis had been worried about my arthritis, about me climbing the stairs. We'd talked about downsizing, maybe getting a ranch-style home. But he would never have left me homeless. Never. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the rain that had grown more violent against the windows. "It's for the best, really," Beverly said, her tone suggesting she was doing me a favor. "You'll have no maintenance, no property taxes to worry about. Ralph will handle selling the house, and you'll get a small portion to help with your expenses." A small portion. Of my own home. "We've already scheduled the estate sale for next weekend," Ralph added, avoiding my eyes. "You'll want to go through your personal things before then. Just the essentials, though. The storage unit we rented is pretty small." Storage unit. They were putting me in storage like seasonal decorations. I looked at my son, my only child, the baby I'd rocked through countless nights, the boy I'd cheered for at every baseball game, the young man I'd helped through college by working double shifts at the diner. His eyes were cold now, calculating. When had he become this stranger? "You have 48 hours, he said, pressing the house keys into my palm. They felt ice cold, foreign. "We'll need the keys back by Thursday. The moving truck comes Friday." "Ralph," I said, my voice stronger now, "I raised you better than this." For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or memory. But Beverly's hand tightened on his arm, and the moment passed. "You're no longer part of this family, Mom," he said quietly, his words cutting deeper than any scream could have. "Not in the way that matters for decisions like this. Dad knew you couldn't handle it alone." The funeral director appeared beside us, clearing his throat apologetically. "I'm sorry, but we need to close up now." Ralph nodded and turned to leave, Beverly gliding beside him like a satisfied cat. I stood there, holding the keys to a house that was no longer mine, watching my son walk away without looking back. But as they reached the door, I moved quickly, quietly, the way I'd learned to move during those long years when Dennis worked nights and I handled everything alone. I slipped something small into Ralph's coat pocket as he shrugged into it. my fingers working with the same steady precision I'd used to pack his school lunches for 12 years. He didn't notice. Neither did Beverly. They disappeared into the rain, and I was alone with my husband's empty casket and the sound of water against glass. I pulled out my phone, an old flip phone that Ralph had mocked just last week, and dialed a number I hadn't used in 20 years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Kathy Brendel speaking. Kathy, it's Maxine. Maxine Winters, from Riverside General. A pause. Then, Maxine? My God, it's been years. How are you? I need help, I said simply. And I think it's time I collected on that old debt. The silence stretched between us, filled with the memory of a night 30 years ago when I'd covered Kathy's shift during her daughter's emergency surgery. No questions asked. When I'd lied to the head nurse about why she was missing, protecting her job when jobs were scarce and single mothers were expendable. Where are you? Kathy asked. Morrison Funeral Home, on Maple Street. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I hung up and looked around the empty room one last time. The flowers would be disposed of tomorrow. The guest book would be filed away. The evidence of Dennis's life would be reduced to whatever Ralph and Beverly deemed worth keeping. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. I walked to the window and watched the rain wash the streets clean, thinking about the small device I'd slipped into Ralph's pocket. About Kathy, who now ran the largest home healthcare network in 3 counties. About the plan that had been forming in my mind since the moment my son told me I was no longer family. Headlights appeared through the rain, and I smiled for the first time in days. The game was just beginning. Kathy arrived in a silver sedan that purred like a well-fed cat. She was 70 now, her auburn hair gone silver, but her movements were still crisp and purposeful as she stepped out into the rain. The years had been kind to her. Designer coat, expensive shoes, the confidence that came from building something substantial from nothing. She looked at me standing under the funeral home's awning, and her expression softened. Maxine, I'm so sorry about Dennis. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We stood there for a moment, 2 old women in the rain, connected by decades of shared exhaustion and mutual respect from our nursing days. Get in, she said. You look like you're about to collapse. The sedan's interior smelled of leather and success. Kathy handed me a thermos of coffee without asking if I wanted it, then pulled away from the curb. The funeral home disappeared behind us, and with it, the last physical connection to Dennis's presence. So, Kathy said, her voice carefully neutral, what kind of help do you need? I told her everything. About the will that couldn't possibly be legitimate, about Ralph's cold dismissal, about Beverly's calculated cruelty, about being given 48 hours to pack up a life and fit it into a storage unit. Kathy listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening with each revelation. Son of a bitch, she said when I finished. That little boy you used to bring to the hospital Christmas parties? The one who called me Aunt Kathy? The same. I sipped the coffee, feeling its warmth spread through my chest. Though I don't think he remembers those parties. Oh, he remembers. People like Ralph remember everything that serves them and forget everything that doesn't. Kathy turned onto Elm Street, driving toward the house I might never see again after Thursday. But you said you had a plan? I reached into my purse and pulled out an identical device to the one I'd planted on Ralph. It was small, black, no bigger than a button. GPS tracker. I ordered them online last month when Dennis started having those dizzy spells. I was worried about him getting lost if he drove somewhere and got confused. Kathy glanced at the device, then back at the road. You tagged your own son. He made it clear I'm not family anymore. That means he's not entitled to the courtesy of privacy from family either. I pocketed the tracker. I know Ralph, Kathy. He's predictable. Greedy, manipulative, but predictable. And he's been lying about something for months. What makes you think that? The phone calls he'd taken another room when he visited. The way Beverly started dressing better, wearing expensive jewelry. The way Ralph kept asking Dennis about his retirement accounts, pushing him to move money around for better tax advantages. I felt my stomach clench with a familiar combination of anger and nausea. I think they've been planning this for a while. Kathy pulled into my driveway, former driveway, and we sat looking at the house Dennis and I had bought 34 years ago. It was a modest two-story colonial, white with blue shutters, surrounded by the rose garden I'd tended for decades. Ralph had played in that garden as a child, building forts between the bushes, chasing fireflies on summer evenings. "It's a beautiful home," Kathy said softly. It was. I opened the car door. "Would you like to come in? I could use the company while I figure out what's worth keeping and what Ralph can sell for whatever he thinks it's worth." The house felt different as we entered, as if it already knew it was being abandoned. The familiar scents of lemon oil and Dennis's aftershave seemed fainter, overwhelmed by something else. The musty smell of betrayal, perhaps. Kathy walked through the living room, taking in the family photos on the mantel. The Afghan my mother had crocheted draped over Dennis's favorite chair. The bookshelf filled with volumes we'd collected over 4 decades together. "They can't just take all of this," she said, picking up a wedding photo. "There are laws about spousal inheritance. Ralph's a real estate attorney. He knows exactly which laws to bend and which ones will break." I sank into my chair, the one that would be sold along with everything else. "But I know Ralph in ways the law doesn't." Kathy set down the photo and looked at me directly. "What do you need?" "A place to stay for a few days, maybe a week. Somewhere Ralph won't think to look." I met her eyes. "And access to your computer system." "My computer system?" "You run home health care for half the county, Kathy. You have access to medical records, insurance information, property records through your billing department." I felt the familiar calm that came when a plan began to crystallize. Ralph's been hiding something, and people who hide things leave digital footprints. They always do. Kathy was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The guest room above my garage is furnished. You could stay there as long as you need." "What about payment? I don't have much." "You covered my shift the night Janet had appendicitis. You lied to Supervisor Morrison about why I was gone. Probably saved my job. You think I forgot that?" Kathy's voice carried 30 years of gratitude. "Besides, I could use someone with your instincts working with me. The healthcare business is cutthroat these days. People try to scam the system constantly." I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of being valued for my mind, not just tolerated as an aging obligation. "There's something else," I said, walking to the kitchen window that overlooked the backyard. "I want to hurt them, Kathy. Not physically, but I want them to understand what they've done. I want them to feel what I'm feeling right now." "And what are you feeling?" I pressed my palm against the cool glass, watching the rain batter the roses Dennis had planted for our 10th anniversary. Dismissed. Erased. Like 43 years of marriage and 62 years of life don't matter because I'm old and inconvenient. "What did you have in mind?" I turned back to her, and I could see my own reflection in the dark window behind me. A woman who'd spent decades being underestimated, overlooked, treated as harmless. It was an advantage I'd never fully appreciated before. Ralph thinks he's smart, but he's lazy smart, not careful smart. He's been cutting corners his whole life because he's never faced real consequences. I walked to the kitchen drawer where Dennis had kept important papers. He's about to learn the difference. I pulled out a manila folder and spread its contents on the kitchen table. Bank statements, insurance policies, investment records. Everything Ralph thought he now controlled. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a series of withdrawals from Dennis's retirement account. 20,000 here, 15,000 there, all in the last 6 months. Always amounts just under the reporting threshold. Kathy leaned over the papers, her practiced eye scanning the numbers. "These are signed with Dennis's name, but Dennis's arthritis was so bad in his hands he hadn't been able to sign his name legibly for 8 months. I'd been signing everything for him, with his verbal consent." I felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Ralph has been forging his father's signature. That's a felony. It gets better. See these investment transfers? Moving money from Dennis's IRA into a joint account with Ralph's name on it. Dennis never agreed to that. He couldn't even remember what day it was half the time these last few months. Kathy straightened, and I could see the healthcare administrator in her taking over. The woman who'd built a business by being smarter and more thorough than everyone who'd underestimated her. "How much are we talking about?" I did quick mental math from the statements. "At least $200,000. Maybe more." "Jesus, Maxine. This isn't just inheritance fraud. This is elder abuse. I know. I gathered the papers back into the folder. And Ralph's going to discover that dismissing your mother as irrelevant was the biggest mistake of his life. The tracker app on my phone chimed softly. Ralph was moving, driving toward the expensive part of town where he'd never been able to afford a house on his legitimate income. He's going to Hillcrest Manor, I said, watching the dot move across the map. That's where Beverly's parents live. Gated community, houses starting at $500,000. How do you know that? Because I pay attention to things Ralph thinks don't matter, like where his wife's family lives, and why he's been so eager to impress them lately. I smiled, and for the first time since the funeral home it felt genuine. Time to see what my son does when he thinks no one's watching. Kathy looked at me with something that might have been admiration. You really have been planning this. No, I said, turning off the kitchen lights and heading toward the stairs to pack what little I'd be allowed to keep. I've been surviving. There's a difference. But as I climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Dennis for 34 years, I realized that survival was about to become something much more active. Ralph had made his choice at the funeral home. Now it was time for him to live with the consequences. Kathy's guest room above the garage smelled of cedar and possibility. It was small, but clean, with a window that overlooked her backyard where autumn maples dropped their leaves like discarded promises. I'd been there 3 days, and each morning I woke with a clarity that had been absent for months. Ralph thought he'd disposed of me. He had no idea he'd simply freed me. The tracker shows he's been to Hillcrest Manor every night this week, I told Kathy over breakfast. She'd insisted on cooking. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Always the same house, always between 7 and 9 p.m. Visiting Beverly's parents? That's what I thought initially. I pulled up the tracking app on my phone, showing her the pattern of movement. But look at this. He parks 2 streets over and walks. If he was just visiting family, why not park in their driveway? Kathy studied the screen, her reading glasses perched on her nose. He's hiding the visits. From someone. The question is who? I sipped my coffee, thinking. I spent yesterday at the county clerk's office. Public records are fascinating when you know what to look for. What did you find? I opened the manila folder that had become my constant companion. The house Ralph's been visiting? It's not owned by Beverly's parents. It belongs to a shell company called Hillcrest Holdings LLC, registered 6 months ago. Let me guess. Ralph's name is on the paperwork, as the managing partner, along with someone named Kenneth Smith. I pulled out a printed property deed. They purchased it for $600,000. Cash. Kathy set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. $600,000? How does a real estate attorney afford that kind of cash? He doesn't. Not legitimately. I felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from solving a puzzle. But a man who's been systematically draining his dying father's accounts for 6 months might have access to that kind of money. You think Ralph bought this house with Dennis's stolen money? I think Ralph and this Kenneth Smith are partners in something that requires a very expensive, very private meeting place. I stood and walked to the window, watching the morning light filter through the maple leaves. The question is what? My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mom, we need to talk. The estate sale is tomorrow. Last chance to get your things. WI showed the message to Kathy, who read it with disgust. He's actually going through with it. Of course he is. Ralph's always been good at burning bridges as long as he's already crossed them. I deleted the message without responding. But I think it's time I paid a visit to Hillcrest Manor myself. Maxine, that could be dangerous. If Ralph's involved in something illegal, then it's time the right people knew about it. I smiled, feeling the cold satisfaction of a plan coming together. But first, I need to make a phone call. An hour later, I was sitting in the offices of Baxter & Associates, the law firm that had supposedly handled Dennis's will. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, had squeezed me in between appointments when I'd mentioned being Dennis Winter's widow. James Baxter was a man in his 50s with the soft look of someone who'd never missed a meal. He greeted me with professional sympathy and offered condolences that felt rehearsed. Mrs. Winters, I'm so sorry for your loss. Dennis was a good man. Thank you. I'm here about the will. Of course. I understand Ralph has already been in to collect the documents. Everything should be in order for the transfer of assets. I leaned forward in my chair, studying his face. Mr. Baxter, when did my husband last visit your office? I'd have to check the files, but I believe it was… Let me see. He pulled out a folder and flipped through it. Here it is. March 15th of this year. That's impossible. Baxter looked up, confused. I'm sorry. My husband was in the hospital with pneumonia for 3 weeks in March. He was admitted on March 10th and discharged on March 31st. I pulled out my own folder and showed him the hospital records. He couldn't have been in your office on March 15th. The color drained from Baxter's face. Mrs. Winters, there must be some mistake. The only mistake was trusting my son. I stood, gathering my papers. I'll be in touch, Mr. Baxter. You might want to review your security footage from that day, if you still have it. I left his office knowing that within hours he'd be on the phone with the State Bar Association. Lawyers didn't take kindly to being used in inheritance fraud schemes. But I wasn't done. My next stop was the Riverside Police Department, where Detective Rosa Kelly had been investigating financial crimes for 15 years. I'd known Rosa since she was a patrol officer who'd responded to a break-in at our house 8 years ago. She was in her 40s now, tough and smart, with the kind of reputation that made criminals think twice. Mrs. Winters, she said, rising from her desk when I was shown into the detective division. I heard about Dennis. I'm sorry. Thank you, Rosa. I'm here because I need to report a crime. Her expression shifted to professional alertness. What kind of crime? I spent the next hour laying out everything I'd discovered. The forged signatures, the unauthorized transfers, the shell company, the house purchase, Ralph's systematic theft of his father's assets. Rosa took notes, asked pointed questions, and grew increasingly grim as the scope of the fraud became clear. This is substantial, she said when I finished. We're talking about multiple felonies, elder abuse, fraud, forgery, possibly money laundering if he's using the house for illegal activities. What happens now? Now we build a case. But Maxine, I have to warn you, family financial cases are complicated. Ralph's your son. Are you sure you want to pursue this? I thought about Ralph's cold voice in the funeral home. You're no longer part of this family. Ralph made his choice, I said. Now I'm making mine. Rosa nodded. I'll need you to sign a formal complaint. Once you do, there's no taking it back. This will destroy his career, probably send him to prison. Good. That evening, I sat in Kathy's living room with a glass of wine and my laptop, researching Kenneth Smith. It didn't take long to find him. He was a developer who specialized in discrete residential conversions and had been investigated twice for running illegal gambling operations out of renovated houses. Look at this, I said, showing Kathy his website. High-end poker games, private betting, exclusive clientele, all very hush-hush, all very illegal. You think Ralph's running a gambling house? I think Ralph's providing the location and legal cover for Kenneth to run one. It would explain the cash, the secrecy, the expensive house. I closed the laptop and looked at her. Tomorrow is the estate sale. Ralph's going to be at my house all day, selling off my life piece by piece. What are you going to do? I smiled, and I could see my reflection in the dark window behind Kathy, a woman who'd found her purpose in the most unlikely place. I'm going to visit Hillcrest Manor while Ralph's busy elsewhere. Rosa's meeting me there with a search warrant at 2 p.m. I sipped my wine, savoring both the taste and the moment. And then I'm going to watch my son's carefully constructed world come crashing down. Maxine, are you sure about this? Once you pull this trigger… Kathy, 3 days ago I was a discarded old woman with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the night sky where a full moon hung like a judge's gavel. Now I'm a woman with a purpose, a plan, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice isn't just a concept in law books. And if Ralph tries to reconcile? If he realizes what he's done and wants to make amends? I thought about that for a long moment. About the little boy who'd called Kathy Aunt Kathy at hospital Christmas parties. About the teenager who'd hugged me after graduation. About the young man who'd promised to always take care of me. Then I thought about his voice in the funeral home, cold and dismissive, erasing 43 years of marriage and 62 years of my life with 7 words. Then he should have thought of that before he decided I was no longer family, I said quietly. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Ralph's about to learn that lesson. The hunter's moon shone down on Hillcrest Manor, and somewhere in that expensive house bought with stolen money, my son was making choices that would define the rest of his life. He just didn't know it yet. But he would. Tomorrow. He would. I woke at 5 a.m. to the sound of rain against Kathy's garage windows. Through the gray dawn, I could see the estate sale signs Ralph had posted throughout the neighborhood, bright yellow arrows pointing toward my former home, advertising the dismantling of my life for bargain hunters and curiosity seekers. By 7, I was dressed in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Ralph's law school graduation 12 years ago. Today felt like another kind of graduation, a final exam in the subject of consequences. You don't have to do this, Kathy said over coffee, though we both knew I did. Yes, I do. I checked my phone. The tracker showed Ralph's car already at the house, probably setting up tables and pricing items he had no right to sell. Rose's team will be in position by 1 p.m. The search warrant's been signed. What about after? When all this is over? I considered the question while watching the rain wash the world clean outside. I don't know. For the first time in 43 years, I get to decide what comes next without considering anyone else's needs first. The freedom of that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll go back to nursing. Maybe I'll help you expand your business. You'd always have a place here, you know. I know. And that means everything. I stood and gathered my purse, my phone, my folder of evidence. But first, I have to finish this. The drive to Hillcrest Manor took 20 minutes through increasingly expensive neighborhoods. Mercedes and BMWs sat in circular driveways. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched between houses that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. It was Ralph's dream world, the place he'd always believed he deserved to live. The house at 1247 Hillcrest Drive was a sprawling colonial with white columns and black shutters, surrounded by professionally landscaped grounds. $600,000 of my husband's stolen retirement money transformed into Ralph's fantasy of success. I parked 2 blocks away, the same spot Ralph used for his clandestine visits, and walked through the drizzle. At precisely 2 p.m., 3 unmarked police cars converged on the house from different directions. Detective Rosa Kelly stepped out of the lead car, her expression grim and purposeful. "Mrs. Winters," she said, approaching me on the sidewalk. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready since Tuesday night." Rosa nodded to her team, and they moved toward the house. The front door opened before they could knock, revealing a man in his 50s with the soft features and expensive clothes of someone who'd never done an honest day's work. Kenneth Smith, I presumed. "Officers, there must be some mistake. Kenneth Smith, you're under arrest for operating an illegal gambling establishment, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Rosa's voice carried the authority of 15 years of putting criminals where they belonged. "You have the right to remain silent." Through the open door, I could see into the house Ralph had bought with blood money. The front rooms had been converted into a casino, poker tables, a roulette wheel, chips stacked in neat piles. The American dream, Ralph style, built on theft and sustained by greed. My phone rang. Ralph's number. "Hello, Ralph." "Mom, what the hell is going on? There are police cars at—" His voice cut off as realization dawned. You did this." "I did what any responsible citizen would do when they discover criminal activity. This is my business, my investment, built with money you stole from your dying father." I kept my voice calm, conversational. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I was too old and stupid to figure out what you'd been doing?" Silence on the other end. In the background, I could hear voices, angry customers, probably, demanding to know why their high-stakes game was being interrupted by reality. I could have handled this quietly, Ralph. I could have confronted you privately, given you a chance to make it right. I watched Rose's team photographing evidence through the windows. But you made a choice on Tuesday. You told me I wasn't family anymore. I didn't mean— Yes, you did. You meant every word. And now you get to live with what that choice cost you. Mom, please, we can work this out. I can pay back the money. With what? The proceeds from selling my furniture, my wedding china, the books Dennis and I collected for 40 years? The anger I'd been holding back for 5 days finally broke through, sharp and clean as a blade. You've been planning this for months, Ralph. The forged signatures on his retirement accounts, the fake will, the partnership with a known criminal. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a systematic betrayal of everything your father and I tried to teach you. Through the house windows, I could see Kenneth Smith being led away in handcuffs. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His carefully maintained composure cracked like a broken mirror. The money from Dad's accounts is gone, isn't it? Ralph's voice had become small, defeated. It's all tied up in this house, in the business. Every penny. Plus the loans you took against it to fund your little casino operation. I'd spent hours with Rosa going through the financial records. You're not just broke, Ralph. You're in debt to some very unpleasant people who don't appreciate losing their investment to police raids. I can fix this. I just need time. You don't have time. Detective Kelly is on her way to the estate sale with a warrant for your arrest. Elder abuse, fraud, forgery, money laundering, operating an illegal gambling establishment. 23 felony counts, Ralph. 23. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of rain and regret, and the distant wail of sirens. Why? He whispered. Why couldn't you just go away quietly? Accept what I was offering? And there it was. The question that revealed everything about who my son had become. Not remorse for what he'd done, but resentment that I'd refused to disappear conveniently. Because I raised you better than this, I said quietly. Because your father deserved better than this. Because 43 years of marriage and 62 years of life earned me the right to exist without your permission. The house will be seized as proceeds of criminal activity, along with everything in it that was purchased with stolen money. I turned away from Hillcrest Manor, walking back toward Kathy's car. The legitimate will, the one Dennis actually signed, leaves everything to me. It's been sitting in our safety deposit box for 15 years. The one you presented was a forgery, and a poor one at that. You're destroying my life. No, Ralph. You destroyed your own life. I'm just making sure everyone knows about it. I hung up and called Kathy. It's done. Rosa has Kenneth, and they're heading to arrest Ralph now. How do you feel? I stood on the sidewalk in the expensive neighborhood my son would never be able to afford legitimately, watching police officers carry evidence out of the house he'd bought with his father's stolen money, and considered the question. Empty, I said finally, but clean. Like I've been carrying around a disease for months and finally found the cure. Come home, Kathy said. I'll make dinner. Home. When had Kathy's garage apartment become home? When had this woman I'd barely spoken to in 20 years become the most important person in my life? I'll be there in an hour, I said. There's one more stop I need to make. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon rain. Dennis's grave was still marked with a temporary placard while we waited for the headstone to be carved. I knelt in the wet grass beside the fresh earth and placed my hand on the ground above his chest. It's finished, I told him. Ralph will go to prison. The money will come back to where it belongs. The house will be ours again. The rain fell steadily, washing away the dirt on my shoes, the tears on my cheeks, the last traces of the woman I'd been on Tuesday night. I'm sorry I couldn't save him, I whispered. I'm sorry our son became someone we wouldn't recognize. But as I stood to leave, I realized I wasn't sorry about everything. I wasn't sorry about the strength I'd discovered in myself. I wasn't sorry about the friendship I'd rebuilt with Kathy. I wasn't sorry about refusing to disappear quietly into the night. Ralph had told me I was no longer part of his family. He'd been right. I was no longer part of a family that could discard a grieving widow like yesterday's newspaper. Instead, I was building something new. A life based on mutual respect, shared strength, and the revolutionary idea that a 62-year-old woman's existence didn't require anyone else's approval. My phone buzzed with a text from Kathy. Ralph's been arrested. Rosa says it went smoothly. Dinner's ready when you are. I smiled and walked back to the car, leaving the old Maxine buried with Dennis, taking only the new one with me into whatever came next. The reckoning was complete. Now, the real life could begin. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my reclaimed house, watching the sunrise paint the walls the same golden color they'd been the morning Dennis died. Everything was exactly as it had been, yet nothing was the same. The house felt larger somehow, as if removing Ralph's presence had created space I'd forgotten existed. The coffee maker gurgled to life. A new one, since Ralph had included the old one in his estate sale before his arrest. I'd bought back several of my own possessions at inflated prices from people who'd attended that sale, including my mother's china and Dennis's collection of first-edition mystery novels. The irony wasn't lost on me, paying strangers for items that had never legally belonged to Ralph in the first place. My phone rang. Kathy's number. "Morning, Maxine. How's the first week back in the house?" "Quiet. Good quiet. Not lonely quiet." I settled into my chair, the one I'd thought I'd lost forever, and watched the roses Dennis had planted bloom in their second spring without him. "Any word from the prosecutor's office?" "Ralph's sentencing is scheduled for Thursday. Rosa thinks he'll get 8 to 12 years with the plea bargain." 8 to 12 years. Ralph would be 50 when he got out, his law license permanently revoked, his reputation destroyed. Old enough to understand what he'd lost, young enough to have to live with it for decades. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, no maternal grief. Just the quiet peace of a ledger finally balanced. What about Beverly? Filed for divorce 3 months ago. Cleaned out their joint accounts and moved back to her parents' house in Florida. Kathy's voice carried a note of grim amusement. Turns out she was only interested in being married to a successful attorney, not a convicted felon. Of course she was. Beverly had always been attracted to Ralph's potential, not Ralph himself. When that potential became worthless, so did the marriage. "Maxine, you still there?" "Just thinking." Ralph lost everything. His career, his wife, his freedom, his future. And I don't feel sorry for him. What does that make me? "Smart," Kathy said without hesitation. "You feel sorry for people who deserve it. Ralph made his choices with full knowledge of the consequences. The only difference is, for once in his life, he had to face them." After we hung up, I walked through the house, reacquainting myself with spaces that felt familiar, yet foreign. Ralph's childhood bedroom, where I'd found his high school trophies packed away in boxes, as if he'd been trying to erase evidence of the person he'd once been. The living room where he'd sat last Christmas, sullen and resentful, complaining about having to visit when he could have been playing golf. Had there been signs? Moments when I could have seen what he was becoming? Perhaps. But I'd been too busy being a mother to notice I was raising a stranger. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the front window, I could see a young woman on my porch, early 20s with dark hair and nervous energy. She looked familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. I opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you? Mrs. Winters? I'm Janet. Janet Brendel, Kathy's daughter." Kathy's daughter? The one who'd had emergency appendicitis 30 years ago, the reason I'd covered Kathy's shift and lied to protect her job, the baby who'd grown up while I wasn't paying attention. "Of course. Come in, please." I stepped aside, studying her face. She had Kathy's strong jawline, but something softer around the eyes. "What brings you here?" Janet followed me into the living room, clutching a manila folder against her chest like armor. "Mom told me what you did for her when I was sick, how you saved her job. Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't have. And Mom never forgot." Janet sat on the edge of the sofa, still holding her folder. "I'm a financial investigator now, for the State Attorney General's office. I specialize in elder abuse cases." "Ah." I settled into my chair, beginning to understand. "And you've been working on Ralph's case." "Not directly, conflict of interest since Mom's involved. But I've been following it, and..." She opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "There are others, Mrs. Winters. Other elderly clients Ralph defrauded over the years. People who don't have someone like you to fight for them." The papers she handed me contained bank statements, forged documents, and account transfers, all bearing Ralph's signature, all following the same pattern he'd used with Dennis. Systematic theft from clients who trusted him to manage their affairs. "How many?" I asked quietly. 17 that we've identified so far. Maybe more." Janet's voice was tight with controlled anger. Ralph didn't just steal from his father. He'd been running this scheme for at least 5 years, targeting elderly clients with substantial assets and no close family to monitor their accounts. I studied the documents, recognizing Ralph's methodical approach in each case. Always amounts just under reporting thresholds. Always from clients whose families lived far away or who had no living relatives. Always with forged authorizations and fabricated investment advice. The prosecutor wants to bring additional charges, Janet continued, but most of the victims are dead now, and their families either don't know about the theft or don't want the publicity of a trial. Ralph's lawyers are pushing for the plea deal to cover all his crimes, not just what he did to your family. But you don't think that's justice. I think 17 elderly people trusted Ralph with their life savings, and he stole from every one of them. I think he should face consequences for all of it, not just the crimes against the one family strong enough to fight back. I set the papers on the coffee table and looked at this young woman who'd inherited her mother's fierce sense of right and wrong. What do you need from me? Testimony. You're the only victim's family member willing to go on record about Ralph's pattern of behavior. If you're willing to testify about the systematic nature of his crimes, the prosecutor can argue against the plea deal and push for the full charges. How much more prison time are we talking about? 25 to 30 years. Maybe life if we can prove he caused any of the victims' deaths through financial stress. Life in prison. Ralph would die behind bars, never seeing another sunrise from his own kitchen, never planting roses in his own garden, never holding grandchildren he'd never have. When's the hearing? Next Tuesday. Mrs. Winters, I know this is asking a lot. He's still your son. No, I said quietly. He's not. A son is someone who protects his family, who honors his parents, who understands that love is responsibility, not entitlement. Ralph stopped being my son the moment he decided I was disposable. Janet's relief was visible. So you'll testify? I'll do more than that. I stood and walked to the window that overlooked my garden, where Dennis's roses were blooming in defiant beauty. I'll help you find the other families. Ralph kept meticulous records. He was always proud of his organizational skills. If there are more victims, there will be evidence. The police already searched his office and home, but they didn't search here. I turned back to her, feeling the familiar surge of clarity that came with having a purpose. Ralph used to store old client files in our basement, boxes and boxes of them, going back years. Dennis always complained about the clutter, but Ralph said he needed them for tax purposes. Janet's eyes widened. You still have his files? Unless he moved them before his arrest. Yes. Would you like to take a look? The basement was dusty and dim, filled with the detritus of Ralph's legal career. File boxes labeled by year stretched along one wall, each containing dozens of manila folders with client names and case numbers. Janet opened the first box with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a treasure trove. This is incredible, she murmured, pulling out files that went back 15 years. It's going to take weeks to go through all of this. Then we'd better get started. We worked through the afternoon, categorizing files, cross-referencing names with state records, identifying patterns of behavior that painted a picture of systematic predation spanning Ralph's entire career. By evening, we'd identified 12 additional victims and found evidence of forgeries dating back to his second year of practice. He never stopped, Janet said, sitting back on her heels among the scattered files. From the moment he started practicing law, he was stealing from clients. It wasn't a recent development, it was his business model. I thought about all the times Ralph had visited over the years, complaining about money, about the house he couldn't afford, about the lifestyle he deserved. All the while, he'd been funding his dreams with other people's life savings. What happens now? Now we build a case that shows Ralph Brown for what he really is, not a lawyer who made some bad decisions, but a career criminal who used his professional position to prey on the most vulnerable members of society. Janet began gathering the files we'd identified as evidence. And hopefully, we make sure he never has the chance to hurt anyone else again. As she loaded the boxes into her car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Purpose beyond revenge. This wasn't about Ralph anymore. It was about 17 elderly people who'd trusted the wrong person and deserved justice. It was about preventing future victims from experiencing what I'd experienced. "Janet," I called as she closed her trunk. "Your mother mentioned that you work with elder abuse cases regularly." "That's right. Do you ever need consultants? People with experience recognizing the signs of financial exploitation?" She paused, studying my face. "Are you offering?" "I'm offering. I have time, experience, and a very strong motivation to make sure people like Ralph face consequences for their actions." Janet smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all day. "I think we could use someone like you, someone who understands both sides of the equation." After she drove away, I stood in my driveway, looking at the house that had become truly mine again. Not because of inheritance or marriage or family obligation, but because I'd fought for it. Because I'd refused to disappear quietly into the night. Inside, I made dinner for one and sat at the kitchen table with Kathy's business proposal spread before me. She wanted to expand her home healthcare network to include financial advocacy for elderly clients, people like Dennis, who needed someone to monitor their accounts and protect them from predators like Ralph. I could do that. I could be the person I'd needed 6 months ago. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mom, I know you won't see me before sentencing, but I want you to know I'm sorry. I never meant for things to go this far. Ralph." I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Sorry wasn't enough. Sorry was what you said when you accidentally stepped on someone's foot, not when you systematically destroyed their life and the lives of 17 other families. Ralph had made his choices. Now he would live with them, just as I was living with mine. Outside, the roses Dennis had planted continued to bloom, beautiful and defiant against the gathering darkness. I had survived the worst thing I'd ever imagined, the complete betrayal by my own child, and emerged stronger on the other side. Tomorrow, I would begin building something new, a life dedicated to protecting others from experiencing what I had endured. A life where being 62 and widowed didn't mean being powerless. Ralph had told me I was no longer part of his family. He'd been right. I was something much better now. I was free.